Unpack the federal budget a bit further now. I'm joined by the CEO of the Grattan Institute, Danielle Wood, to discuss, well, some of the issues here, including what's affordable and what's good spending here. Danielle, thanks very much for your time today. Let's just start. You've mapped out what you describe as relative restraint, and that is previous improvements in the budget bottom line over the past couple of budgets have all been taken up by increased spending. Now, we know they've spent more money, the government, but they haven't banked all of this money at least. Relative restraint, that's what you're calling it?
Look, relative restraints, it's exactly right. So, as you say, historically, we've tended to spend our windfalls. This time around, the windfall is very large, and I think that is worth noting, that we're going to be collecting about $110 billion extra tax revenue over the next 4 years than we thought even just 4 months ago. So the windfall's big. So, yes, they're not spending it all, but particularly in the next year, there's a lot of front-end loaded spending in this budget because of the things like the tax offset and the fuel excise cut. Almost half of it is actually going out the door over the next year.
Interesting to note, ANU analysis suggesting that half of this spending, a bit more than half, is going to the top half of households. It leads me to this question, and perhaps I'm, taking aim at a sacred cow here, but how much in a macro sense do we really need assistance? Now, yes, petrol prices are going up and wages haven't, but there's also, because these payments are one-off payments, there's also a lot of money in households in some form post-COVID. Payments that were given, holidays that were never taken, and money sitting there to use, and these ultra-low interest rates where if you're running a good household budget, when those rates just plummeted, you don't adjust your spending, you're putting away some of that money.
Look, I think that's exactly right. And it is clear that there are households that are facing cost of living challenges. We can see that wages aren't keeping up with inflation this year. But on the other hand, consumer spending is really strong. So the budget's saying, it's running at 3.5% this year. It's going to increase to 5.75% next year. So some of those spending, is expected to be spent down. And my concern really is that we're kind of over-egging the cost of living reaction. So, yes, maybe some targeted support, particularly to welfare recipients, is in order. But, come tax time, we're going to be pumping out about $13 billion out the door in tax offsets on top of that fuel excise cut. Just the household assistance alone is actually bigger than the first stimulus response to the global financial crisis. So we're pumping a lot of money into the economy to deal with, a cost of living issue, while the economy is actually otherwise running quite strongly. We've got low unemployment, strong GDP growth, and of course you risk actually putting further pressure on prices and bringing interest rate movements forward.
Yeah, so then you pump up inflation and the money the government hands out is soaked up by interest rates. So you're talking about possibly partly a transfer to banks, not that the government would paint it that way. Infrastructure, interested to hear what you've said about infrastructure, because a lot of these projects are not on the Infrastructure Australia priority list. Politically, it leads to the question, why bother having this list? But also, we don't even have business cases completed at a time when we're already short on labour and materials for these sorts of projects. So they're loading more things onto the slate when the in tray, if you like, is already bulging.
Exactly right. So, I think we should always be worried when we see big promises around infrastructure spending prior to an election. And certainly our analysis that's looked at this issue historically has suggested you do see kind of overweight in announcements towards marginal electorates. But, it is a concern about just use of taxpayers' money if we don't have business cases for all of these projects. And as you said, a very full pipeline. We've already had warnings about shortages of materials and machinery and key labour. We've had state treasurers saying that they might have to put the go slow on some of the projects that are already underway because of these challenges. It just does not make sense to pile a whole lot more into the pipeline at this point in the cycle.
Now, debt is the final one I want to ask you about. Net debt is set to peak as a percentage of GDP at 33%. This has become the government's preferred measure because as the economy grows, that figure shrinks, albeit ever so slowly. Seemingly from both major parties, we don't have any plans to actually have fiscal restraint to pay off that debt. Do you think it's sustainable to just let that figure come down ever so slowly as a percentage of GDP and not really look to tackle it?
Look, I don't have any concerns about fiscal sustainability in the short term, and certainly then the numbers in the budget do highlight that, we will expect to see it stabilise and then come down. My concern is more around the kind of medium-term picture. So we are coming out of COVID with substantially higher spending as a share of GDP than what we went in. So that's, taking out the kind of emergency response, but looking to the longer term, we've baked in higher spending on defence, we've baked in higher spending on the NDIS, we've baked in higher spending on aged care, and we've had no conversation about how we're going to pay for that. So, that short-term story about debt coming down is not going to hold unless we talk about that longer-term structural budget position. And that's really, I think, what's missing from the conversation at the moment. What are we going to be doing in 10 years' time?
Yeah, and essentially that if the spending and forecasts held as is, that would be fine, but will they is the question. Danielle, really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Tom.